words taxes and Denmark seem to come up a lot together in the American news media and in conversation, especially if you work at a Danish-American museum. Many Americans we talk to at the museum say they're glad they don't have those Danish taxes. On the other hand, many envy the setup of their social programs like healthcare and education. So that got us wondering, what does the Danish tax model actually look like, and how does it compare to the United States? And honestly, what are some factoids we can share to sound smart, or myths we can bust so that we're fun at parties? To help us get to the bottom of it, we pinned down Ulrik Boesen from the Tax Foundation, a US-based nonprofit which published an insightful article in February titled Insights into the Tax Systems of Scandinavian Countries. Ulrik is from Denmark, and he said he's heard of our museum. Disclaimer, this is not a political discussion in the conventional sense, but more of an explainer. We would like to keep political opinions out of it and talk about the existing systems for the educational value. All right, Ulrik, thank you for Zooming with me today. First, do you solemnly swear to make this as nonpartisan as humanly possible?
Absolutely.
What is it that you do for the Tax Foundation, and how did you get there?
So my role is a senior policy analyst with our state team. So my main job is to analyze tax policy proposals and tax codes across all 50 states and the District of Columbia. I have an additional focus on excise taxation. So excise taxation will be anything from tobacco taxes, motor fuel taxes, airfare taxes, cannabis taxes, whatever product-specific taxes are out there. So that's what I spend a lot of my time looking at. I ended up at Tax Foundation because I had worked previously in tobacco and finance, and had gotten a lot of interaction with tax policy and how tax policy affects taxpayers and businesses. So I brought that knowledge to the Tax Foundation. It's been able to sort of expand my understanding of tax policy and help them build out a program that focuses on these industry-specific or product-specific taxes and how they impact businesses that operate in those fields. So that's what I spend most of my days doing. The Tax Foundation is a 501c3, which means we don't lobby at all. We're an educational organization. So we spend most of our time writing and publishing analyses. We speak to taxpayers, to lawmakers, to reporters, and try and help them better understand how tax policy affects businesses, affects taxpayers, and affects the economy in general. So that's who we are and my role in the machine.
Awesome. And you are from Denmark, right? Where did you grow up?
That is correct. I grew up in a small suburb outside of Copenhagen called Solrød. But I lived in Copenhagen from 2010 until 2019 when we moved over here.
So let's talk about income taxes. I think that's probably what's on people's mind when they talk about taxes regarding the Danes versus the Americans. On a basic level, how does it work in Denmark, and how does that compare to the US model?
Most of the revenue that is collected by the Danish government is done through the personal income tax. That's very different from the US. It's also very different from the other Scandinavian countries. So one way to look at it is to look at how does taxes impact the total cost of labor. So the numbers here will indicate an employer out of their expense for labor, how much of that is taxes. For Denmark, 35% of the employer's cost is the personal income tax. That's wildly different from the US, where we have payroll taxes, both employee side and employer side payroll taxes. And the personal income tax in the US is only 15% of the total cost of labor. And then there's 7% on each side in terms of the payroll taxes. So that's a very different system. Danes pay a lot of income taxes. but they don't pay the other taxes out of their income. So that's a different system. The rates also tend to be higher. The main reason that the rates are higher is not so much the statutory rate. So if we look at the statutory rate, the highest top personal income tax rate in Denmark is about 56%. In the US, it's about 44%. Both are relatively high. The main difference is actually when the top statutory rate applies. So if we take the average income and say, how much more than the average income do you have to make before you're liable to pay the top rate? In Denmark, it's only 1.3 times the average income. In the US, it's 9.2 times. So the Danish system is a lot more flat. A lot more people pay that higher rate, where in the US, you have to make a lot of money before you're liable to pay the top rate. So that's the main difference. Even though there is a difference in the statutory rates, that's not as significant as who actually pays that top rate. That's the main difference between the systems.
When I looked at statistics that I could compare, it was like 2019 from each side. The median incomes are really pretty similar. They're not too much different between Denmark and the US when you do the conversion. Is that what you think as well, or is it pretty comparable, the wages and salaries?
Yeah, I think so. Again, Denmark is a small, tiny country compared to the US, and it's very visible in the differences. So the span between those making the least and those making the most in Denmark is just smaller than it is here. But if we look at the average income, they are very comparable.
Do Danes file an annual income tax return like what is common here in the US?
Yeah, so that's actually a funny difference. A lot of it's very similar, but Denmark has moved much quicker to a fully automated system. So the way it works is similar. So you have your taxes withheld from your pay stub every month. And by the end of the year, you go in and fill out your annual tax return. The difference is in Denmark, you basically look through an already filled out tax return because they have all the information on you already, and you either approve or make small changes. Whereas in the US, we can spend a couple of days trying to fill out the information, making sure everything is correct, having often to ask accountants or use tax software to make sure we get it right. In Denmark, that's all been automated, and it's a much easier system, I would say. But again, when you have about 3.5 million or 4 million taxpayers versus over 200 million taxpayers, it can be easier to design a system and cheaper to design a system that encompasses that. So that's part of it. But the tax system in Denmark is definitely simpler for the taxpayer because a lot more of it is handled automatically without the taxpayer having to really concern themselves with it.
So what about other taxes that individuals pay, like sales and property tax?
So the other main difference between the systems is the sales tax versus the VAT. So in the US, we know the sales tax. You go and buy something, the sales tax applied. When you get to the cashier, whatever state or locality you're in, there might be a different rate. In Denmark, it's 25% on everything you buy. And it's built into the price. So you don't see it in the same way. The price that you see when you're in the grocery store is what you end up paying. Obviously, 25% is a lot higher than the average sales tax in the US. And it's another very important source of tax revenue. It sort of goes back to the same point from the income taxes, because the difference between poor and rich is smaller, there's less of a concern about regressivity in Denmark. Because 25% on all consumption is very regressive. Obviously, if you make less, more of your income will be spent on consumption. If you apply 25% tax to all consumption, someone not making very much money would pay a lot more as a percentage of their income than someone making a lot of money. But because the differences are smaller, that's less of a concern. There's also I think, a cultural thing driving this. Because the welfare state is so large and ever present in Denmark, everyone in some way or another is gaining benefit or utilizing services that are available in welfare state. So the idea is that everyone pays into it in a similar way. So even if you don't make a lot of money, you're still expected to pay a lot of taxes. So I think in the US, something like 50% of taxpayers don't have a federal income tax liability because of the tax credits. The standard deduction in Denmark is about $2,000, and after that, you're liable for taxes, which means the vast majority are paying income taxes. And then you add on top of that the 25% VAT on all consumption. So everyone's paying a lot of taxes. Those taxes obviously fund the healthcare system, the schools, the colleges, daycares, and all the other things that are either fully covered or subsidized by the government. That's a very big difference from the US system.
Surely by now, the Danes know that they're paying a higher tax rate than pretty much anywhere else in the world. Someone has told them, right? What do the taxes fund that may be different from things in the US? And why is this tax structure tolerated?
So the main things I would say are the ones that are also being discussed here very often. Healthcare and university tuitions. Both 100% taxpayer funded in Denmark. So you never get a bill when you go to the hospital, and colleges are free or taxpayer funded. There's even a government stipend for people going to college. So when you're a student, you are eligible to receive, and this might be outdated, but when I was a student, it was about $800 a month in a stipend that you got as a student. So that's part of the social contract. I think it really is a question of size. A small, tightly knit society where everyone trusts their neighbor might be willing to have a system like this because they know that they'll benefit from it as well. It's not like it's without issues. You can't shop around. So if you go to a hospital, you don't get a say in what medicine you want. You get the one that's available. There may be longer waiting times for certain procedures because the system has to prioritize. So you're more of a client than you are a customer. And that's not always a positive experience for Danes. But on the whole, Danes trust the system. Because it's 5 million people, they're never far away from whoever's making the decisions. And I think that's crucial to having such a big welfare state is you have to feel that you're really part of it. Otherwise, people wouldn't be willing to pay these kind of taxes. It's the same across the other Scandinavian countries, Sweden and Norway. The flip side of it is Danes and Norwegians specifically are a little more guarded when it comes to non-Danes or non-Norwegians because the system there's a little bit of for us, by us mentality. We created this system. We should be the one that benefit. So there's very hostile feelings towards immigration in those two countries because there's a worry that all the money that we have been putting into the system, we should be benefiting from. We can't be having a lot of people immigrating and taking advantage of what we have built and paid for. So that's where you see that sort of mentality that we accept it because we benefit from it, but we don't want everyone else to benefit from it because we're the ones paying for it. That's the flip side of this whole thing, because a welfare state is inclusive for the people that live there, but it's very exclusive. It has a very exclusive mentality because the cost is so high to the individual Dane.
As you may know, the Museum of Danish America falls primarily in the history museum category, and a lot of Danish immigrants came over in the late 1800s, 1900s, turn of the century. So historically, has it always been like this? What kind of change has happened over time with taxes in Denmark?
So it really happened after World War II. Up until then, taxes were quite low. Even throughout some of the decades after World War II, the taxes were lower in Denmark than they were in the US. So it's a relatively new phenomenon. Through the 70s and 80s is when the welfare state was really expanded. So yeah, I mean, it's a relatively new development, but there's also overwhelming support for it in the Danish political system among Danish voters. So there's not really any political parties that are trying to dismantle parts of the welfare state. There obviously are debates about the size and development, but on the whole, no one's going to talk about maybe it would be a good idea to not cover college tuitions, or maybe it would be a good idea to dismantle the public healthcare system, or whatever else may be up for discussion. Those are not really taking place. They're really discussing much smaller parts of the welfare state, tweaks. We like to say that the annual budget that's passed by the government, there's always a big discussion every fall when they're about to pass the budget for the next year. And the joke is that 99% of that budget writes itself, and they're just really fighting over between 0.5% and 1% of the budget.
It's automated, like the income taxes.
Pretty much, yeah. These are all the things we must pay for that must be available. And then we'll discuss like the little tiny details about wait lists on hospitals, or how many adults must be per kid in the daycare, or whatever else. But it's always smaller, minor tweaks.
Right. So in a nutshell, because it can get complicated, of course, what about businesses? You would imagine that businesses just face layer upon different layer of tax burden. Why would anybody do business in Denmark? What is it like for those larger entities?
So right now, the corporate income tax is at the same level as the U.S. corporate income tax. So that's very similar. The main cost of businesses is labor cost. It's very expensive to hire someone because tax rates are so high, you have to pay them a lot. That's the main cost. The other high tax that can limit people's interest in maybe not creating a business, but growing a business is capital gains taxes. So in the US, I think long-term capital gains tax is around 20% that we pay off. When we sell stock equity, we pay 20% off of that capital gains. In Denmark, it's 42%. So there's less of an interest to invest because you need a lot more return to see some benefit. So what we have seen in Denmark is there's a lot of entrepreneurs starting businesses, growing businesses, but at a certain point, they move away from the country. So some of the largest, most successful companies are all very old. The ones that Americans tend to know are Lego. It's a very old company. Started before all of these taxes were implemented. There's Velux, which is they make windows. Very successful company. And there's Maersk, which is one of the largest shipping companies in the world. These are all 100-year-old companies. Today, unfortunately, a lot of businesses that are started and are successful, they move to countries with lower tax rates. So they'll move to the UK, for instance, or Germany, or the Netherlands. where you see a lot more return on your investment because of that high capital gains tax rate and because labor is so expensive.
Something we have found over the years is that Danes have a different view of philanthropy and nonprofit giving because there aren't the same incentives like the tax burden reduction that you get when you give a gift to a charity. And a lot of the nonprofits that you would think of in Denmark are publicly funded. So what do the Danes, how do they go about charity? What is it like for them? Are there any tax benefits to that? Any kickbacks?
There is a small deduction available when you give to charity. But Danes, and I forget, but I've seen some stats before. Danes are not very generous people when it comes to giving to charities. I think that's less to do with the tax deduction and more to do with the sense that I think Danes feel that they've already contributed enough because of the high taxes. And that with the amount of tax they pay, there should be funds available to whatever a charity is doing. I think it has changed a little bit with online charities. It's now easier to give. People can create, their own little charities in an afternoon. And Danes will contribute, obviously, if they support something. But the larger, like the Red Cross and whoever else are there and are collecting on an annual basis, they have a harder time in Denmark than they do in many other places. And I think because of the high tax rates, in that sense that Danes feel I contributed enough. I pay about half my salary in taxes. There should be funds available to whatever this charity wants to do. And as you say, a lot of the big organization nonprofits are receiving government funds, and a lot of them. So one of the biggest ones is the Danish Cancer Association. It's a huge patient organization that helps people, obviously, who get cancer or families or people who lose a family member. They get millions of public funds. And I think that could be a fine system, but I think it dampens Danes' interest in them contributing out of their paycheck.
So for fun, what are some things Americans might consider to be weird Danish taxes or Danish tax laws?
I think the number one is the car tax. So Danes pay 150% on the value of a car when you buy a car, plus the VAT. So Danes drive very small, cheap cars because it is very expensive to get a car. So the number one selling car over the last few years has been a Volkswagen Up, which is a tiny, tiny little car. But Danes will pay about $30,000 for that car, which means it's probably valued at around 15, right? Now, it's a country where distances are in no way similar to here. If a Dane has to drive more than 30 minutes, they consider that a long drive. That was a big culture shift for me moving over here. My in-laws live up in Pittsburgh and we live in Virginia. It's about a 4-hour drive. My wife considers that an easy drive. I consider that a very long drive.
To take you out of the country in Denmark.
Yeah, exactly. That would be leaving the country. So that, I think, is the most peculiar tax that Danes have. It also, the idea of that tax is that money goes toward infrastructure. So you pay a car, you're likely to be driving on the road. So that's how you're going to cover the cost of that. But gasoline taxes are also much higher than they are here. In a gallon of gas, last time I was home, so you do the math, would be about $7. which if you if you were a president who was responsible for gasoline reaching $7, you'd be in trouble here.
Yeah, for sure. Not getting voted back in.
Yeah, exactly. But that's the reality there. Now, people are less dependent on cars, distances are shorter, and public transportation is available to most people. And then Danes like to bike. In Copenhagen, a majority of commuters bike every day. That's how the society has decided to develop. That's a huge difference.
Right. It really incentivizes taking the train or using a cycle instead of paying double the value of your car to drive around.
Exactly. Which they get away with, I think, because the distances are much shorter. There's a much smaller group of Danes that are really dependent on their cars, whereas here, obviously, a lot of people are fully dependent on the ability to get in their car to get to school or their job.
I think it's shocking to Americans about the church tax, how you can support the Danish church or, opt out of it.
I want to say, it's just a historical coincidence that the church in Denmark is an integral part of the state, of the government. Since 1536, I think, when Danes left the Catholic Church and became Protestants, the church has played a massive role in the Danish government. Up until today, where unless you opt out, you pay around 1% of your income in church taxes. The church has been responsible for registering when a child is born, making sure they get a CPR number, which is the equivalent of a social security number. Obviously, weddings, funerals, all those things are then available to Danes. But the church plays a big role in government, although it's obviously smaller now than it was previously. And a majority of Danes voluntarily pay into the system because there is the opt-out option. But I think a lot of Danes appreciate having a church in their town. Even they may not frequent it very often, but they like that it's there. It's always been there. A lot of the churches are 500-600 years old. And they appreciate having that piece of history right down the street. Most Danish kids around the age of 15 will be confirmed or have their confirmation in the Danish church. It's part of growing up. Sort of like a Sweet 16 style party the Danes will have around that time. Originally, obviously, that would coincide with you leaving school and having to start working. That's no longer the case, but that's why it was around that time. You were an adult when you were 15, 16 years old. So the church has played a big role in government. Doesn't obviously impact policy in many ways, but is a part of how Danes have designed their system. It is common across the European states. I think just out of for historical reasons. When all the Europeans left Europe, part of the reason they left was because of those state churches. They wanted to practice their faith in another way. So it makes sense to me that Americans designed their system differently. The guys who stayed were less concerned with that, so they kept the system going.
Sure, makes sense. And also public television, like DR, has a lot of funding.
Yeah, that's one of the parts of the annual debate that actually can get people really fired up. So there is and again, that a lot of Americans will understand that. Right of center politicians or voters in Denmark believe that the public television is almost propaganda for left of center policies. So they always want to cut the funding to DR because they're just spewing out propaganda. They're not being unbiased. So let's cut their funding. I don't think anyone wants to dismantle it completely, but there's definitely been a lot of discussion over what's the appropriate amount of money being given to public television. One of the reasons that many Danes do support public television is when you have 5.5 million people who are the only ones in the world that speak our language, you need to protect that language. So if we all were always just watching American or British television, we might lose our language. So there's an interest in creating content 100% in Danish to make sure that our language keeps evolving and keeps staying relevant. And they've been very successful over the last couple of decades, even exporting television to other countries. So a lot of Brits watch a ton of Danish television, like Borgen, which was hugely popular a few years ago, was about Danish politics. I've even had Americans ask me about it. Now it's less of a tax and more of a fee. So they'll send you an invoice 4 times a year of a couple $100 4 times a year. That you must pay it if you own a TV or a radio, because then you can enjoy the content. A lot of Danes will do their best not to pay it, to be honest. A lot of it is very similar. So obviously there's excise taxes and all the sinful products, like you pay excise tax on gambling, on tobacco and alcohol, property taxes paid to localities or counties, just like here. So those are less interesting, and they're about the same rates too. And Danes complain about their property taxes at about the same rate as Americans do, because it's the one tax where we know exactly what we're paying, because they send you a bill, say there's your property tax bill. Whereas the income tax, we can sometimes forget because it's just being withheld. We don't necessarily know. We know what will go into our bank account at the end of the month, but the dollar amount, we can sometimes forget. The property tax, we all know exactly what we're paying. It bothers a lot of taxpayers. That's exactly the same.
Good. We can complain in solidarity.
Yeah, that's very true. I think for me personally, at the end of the day, having to pay health insurance and another couple of things here out of pocket, at the end of the day, it's very similar what you have left once all that's paid off. The big difference is sort of outside tax policies, and it's more of a question of free choice and being able to shop around. So Danes can't do that because there's one provider. You must use that provider because that's the government provider. Danes accept that. I don't know that Americans would if they were just told this is who you must work with because that's the government provider, and we're going to just charge you automatically through taxes. The costs are very similar. Americans have more of a choice than Danes do. But obviously, if you're lower middle class in Denmark, it can sometimes be easier because you won't have those big surprise bills. Like you go to the hospital, you don't get a bill. You send your kid to college, you don't get a bill. So that can be easier. That being said, the kids that do go to college in Denmark are exactly the same kids that go to college over here. It's not just cost that's determining that. So the majority of kids in the universities in Copenhagen are kids of upper middle class parents, just like here. So it doesn't solve everything, but it can be helpful, obviously, to the kids that do have the abilities, but maybe don't have the funds.
So if someone is interested in learning more about this, what are some resources? Where should they go?
Well, you can learn a lot more about basically not just Danish taxes, but European taxes as a whole, or taxes in other OECD countries, and particularly the US tax system, by visiting our website, which is www.taxfoundation.org. They're obviously also welcome to contact me if they have any specific questions. They can catch me on Boesen, which is UBOESEN at taxfoundation.org. And I'll be more than happy to talk to anyone who has questions about US taxes or Danish taxes or Swedish taxes, for that matter.
It's been great having you and learning more about taxes and tax policy and how those compare between the two of us. Thank you again, Ulrik. It's been a pleasure, and we'll keep in touch.
Thank you so much, Nathan. Thanks for having me.
If you or your organization would like to help us continue to bring virtual content to the masses, please get in touch. We'd love to talk to you. And we hope to see you on June 26th for our virtual and in-person Midsummer Festival. See you then. Yeah, so like excise taxes, that can be used as a tool to discourage consumption. So like cigarettes, high taxes, oh, it's expensive, maybe I'll cut back. Is that the same in Denmark? Is it used as a tool in that way for certain products?
Yes, it is. It's a relatively new way of looking at these taxes. So traditionally, both here and in Denmark, it's been a pure revenue generator. So the idea being cigarettes are addictive, which means we can raise taxes on them and people will still buy them, which means they're a great revenue tool. That mentality has shifted a little bit. And now there's an interest in designing tax policy that will help smokers specifically move away from consuming cigarettes because they're so bad for you. But other excise taxes are not like that. Like, we don't levy a tax on gasoline to make people not buy it. We levy it on gasoline to raise revenue to pay for all roads. We levy taxes on alcohol at relatively low levels, not so much to discourage consumption, but to raise revenue. I mean, in the US, if we go back to the time around World War II, excise taxes were by far the largest revenue generator, both at the federal level and at the state levels, because we didn't have, there weren't very many sales taxes at the time. Income taxes were new and were very low rates, but excise taxes were very common. And they were levied on products that a lot of consumers consume, such as alcohol, and back then also tobacco. So if we go back to the 60s, majority of people smoked, so they were great, for taxation, right for taxation. That's changed a little bit. And rates are actually very comparable between the US and Denmark, and prices too. They're about the same cost.
You mentioned your work with the Tax Foundation. You are primarily working with policy that is coming up. You're not doing a lot of retroactive analysis, are you?
Right now I'm really focusing on upcoming issues. Oftentimes, especially with excise taxes and these specific taxes on cannabis or motor fuel, taxes can often be forgotten as part of whatever regulatory or legislative design that lawmakers are considering. So what we try to do is to make sure that there's an understanding among taxpayers, but also lawmakers, about how the decisions they make may impact different industries or taxpayers. So one example, we've been working a lot on cannabis taxation because many states have been legalizing cannabis.
And the tax discussion around cannabis is often completely left out. So they'll just throw some taxes on there. So we try to make sure to elevate that conversation so that businesses who want to operate in that space can understand how taxes may impact them. And the lawmakers that are looking to legalize or regulate this product can understand how decisions surrounding tax policy might determine the success or failure of legalizing a product like cannabis. So that's where we're trying to play that role as educators, making sure that people in and around these processes understand the impact of tax policy decisions. And obviously, we want to make sure they take decisions that benefit both revenue generation, but also businesses and taxpayers as well. So we're trying to walk that line of designing tax policy that can be a benefit for all. It's not always easy, but that's who we try to be. And in the majority of the excise tax world, the discussion is really on upcoming legislation or trending legislation. So cannabis, sports betting, plastics, severance taxes on spring water, and all these kind of things. So there's a lot happening in this space that we try and be a voice of reason and bipartisan sort of policy design, I guess you would say.
Right.